Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Strive's webinar on our 2022-2023 proxy voting season. Looks like we've got a good number of attendees, but quite a few more that have signed up. So we'll give everybody here about 45 seconds to join in the queue. While folks are joining, some housekeeping items. You'll see in the webinar that in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, there's a console with a drop-down menu. Here, there's different tools that you can use to engage with us throughout the webinar. First, there's a question and answer tool. You'll be able to ask questions all throughout the webinar, and we're going to address as many of them at the end as we possibly can. Those that we aren't able to address due to time, we can email you the answers to those questions later on. Also, you'll notice in the engagement tools, there's a content tool. Here you can access our entire 2022-2023 proxy season report, because in our limited amount of time this afternoon, there's absolutely no way we're going to be able to cover all of those topics. So we hope that you download it and read that at your leisure later on. You'll also have access to a link to Strive's website. So with that, looks like we've got quite a few folks that have joined. Again, please use the content tools in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. That's where you'll be able to engage with us, find our content, and ask us questions and answers. So first of all, who is Strive? Well, Strive was formed early last year with a very unique mission in the asset management space. Our mission is to maximize value to our clients by refocusing companies on excellence. Full stop. Again, we started early last year. We now have a team of more than 40 plus dedicated employees based in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio, with folks relocating from all over the country that are really focused on this mission. And this mission is, again, to reorient the capital markets to focus on shareholder primacy and away from the drift that we've seen towards stakeholder capitalism and the three-letter acronyms that regularly fly under the banner. Earlier this year, Strive was actually recognized as the fastest growing asset manager in America. We launched our first product last August on the New York Stock Exchange. Fast forward, we now have 11 products in the marketplace. And in September of this year, we crossed over $1 billion in assets under management. It took ARC 40 months, JP Morgan 31 months, and Pacer ETFs 28 months respectively to cross over the threshold that Strive achieved in just 13 months. And now, what are we doing with our growth, our AUM? Well, we're engaging from the corporate governance arena in investment stewardship. And there's two arms to investment stewardship. A, the proxy voting that we're going to focus on today, but let's not forget the corporate engagements that we mirror with our proxy voting in order to, again, refocus companies on excellence, steer them away from the drift that they've been making towards stakeholder capitalism and its accompanied three-letter acronyms such as ESG and DEI, and again, to focus the capital markets back towards shareholder primacy. I've gotten this question for many years. Why are shareholder proposals so important? Why are proxy votes important? Why do they matter, Justin? The answer is really very simple. They move the cultural needle. What the proponents of shareholder proposals know, and large asset managers and proxy advisory services that make recommendations and votes on proxy ballots, is that you do not need to change a law to change the culture. You do not have to win a court battle to change the culture. If you can move corporate behavior in a direction that reflects your values, you can effectuate not just corporate culture, but society writ large. Let's take an example of what this looks like. A couple of years ago, 2017 and 2018 timeframe specifically, there were a lot of shareholder proposals calling on companies to diversify their boards. And what they meant by that, the proponents were asking for diversity of skin color, diversity of race, gender, sexual orientation, the simple affirmative action type of diversity. These were put on by proponents that were, again, seeking to drive their ideological value into corporate America. Now, many companies went ahead and adopted these resolutions. Well, fast forward to 2020 and 2021. That was when Goldman Sachs announced that they were no longer going to finance a company's initial public offering unless they had 2 affirmative action diverse board seats. That's when NASDAQ put in place a rule that will go into effect January 1st of next year, in which it will delist companies from its exchange. That is, take away their ability to get public funds in the public marketplace if they don't have affirmative action diverse board seats. So the agent of change in 3 to 4 years in American society went from shareholder proponents putting items on corporate ballots to Goldman Sachs and the NASDAQ. And this happens on issue after issue after issue. So again, these votes may seem a little wonkish, may seem to not be important to everyday Americans. Well, they affect American life. And that's why at Strive, we focus so heavily on getting every single proxy vote right for our clients. So let's take a quick look now at the topics that we want to cover today. Again, we're not going to be able to hit in granular detail all of our proxy votes from this year. Soon we'll get into the metrics and you'll understand why. But at a high level, of course, we're going to touch on votes for E, S, and G shareholder resolutions. That's environment, social, and corporate governance resolutions. We're also going to take a little bit of extra time to talk about the votes that we make for or against executive compensation packages, proposals that are also known as say on pay, where shareholders can give a non-binding vote to approve or disapprove of the pay packages for named executive officers at corporations. We're also going to talk about how Strive thinks about voting for board members and CEOs who sit on boards specifically. After that, I'm going to touch briefly on some of the high-profile, newsworthy issues related to corporate governance generally and proxy voting specifically. Believe me, 14 years ago at my former firm, when I started focusing on engaging corporate America through the proxy ballot, I did not think that proxy voting would be making headline news, let alone be the subject of debates on Capitol Hill, in state houses across the country, and even up to our US presidential election. But that's where we find ourselves in the final month of 2023. So first, before we get into the votes, let's talk about the data. As you can see from the slide on your screen, we voted about 2,000 ballots in the 2022-2023 season. That includes more than 21,000 individual votes. And our coverage spanned 35 different countries. What's Strive's main voting philosophy? Well, we vote with an eye single on maximizing shareholder value. We vote as a sole fiduciary. Will a vote for this board member, management proposal, or shareholder proposal hurt, harm, or help a company's financial return? We're not voting to advance anybody's values. We are simply voting to drive shareholder value forward, full stop. What does this look like at the next level? At the next level, you can think about our vote as aggressively apolitical, in the sense that what we're attempting to do as well is to depoliticize the corporate ballot box. Again, much of what's being debated on the corporate proxy ballot does properly belong on a ballot, in Strive's opinion. It's just ballots that we cast for our local, state, and federal politicians. Why? Because those politicians are responsible to the American electorate. Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney, folks, he's not responsible to the American electorate. He's responsible as a fiduciary duty of loyalty and care to his shareholders. What we're witnessing is essentially a workaround of the tripart government and federalist system that our founders set up. Again, think about Bob Iger and Disney and their opposition to parental rights legislation. We don't think it's Strive that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison sat down and hoped one day that the opposition to state parental rights laws in a state would come from a major entertainment company. That's not the system they set up. They set up a tripart federal government and federalism so that folks in Florida, if they don't like what's going on, they can vote with their, ballot on the political ballot, and they could vote with their feet because we've got a federalist system as well. Again, what we're witnessing on a lot of proxy votes is forum shopping by aggrieved political actors that are unable to achieve either at the ballot box or in the court systems what they're hoping for. Let me give you one concrete example. California has for years attempted to pass state law mandating board diversity for gender and board diversity for racial composition. This has been thrown out by the courts. But again, if you can go around the court system, around the legislature, and mandate that companies do it through the corporate ballot box, you've changed culture without changing a law or getting a court opinion that you were searching for. So with that philosophy in mind, how do we approach our voting? At Strive, we use a human touch. We do not use any algorithms whatsoever. And this is fairly unique in the proxy voting space. Why do we do this? Well, because a lot of algorithms vote based on taxonomy. What is the title of the shareholder proposal? For example, we talked about board diversity proposals on affirmative action. There's also board diversity proposals on viewpoint diversity, diversity of thought. Now, if you're just voting based on the taxonomy of the headline of that proposal, well, you're going to get in your own mind some of those proposals right and some of them wrong, depending on your perspective of what kind of diversity boards should have, right? Furthermore, we look beyond the four corners of the language of any resolution. A lot of shareholder proponents use very anodyne language when they put a ballot item on a proxy statement because they don't want to give away their true motivations. Well, if you go to a lot of websites of the proponents, they will happily tell you who they are, what they want, and what they expect from corporate America. So again, you have to read past the headline, past the four corners to understand the essence of a proposal if you're going to get the vote right. So again, others who just rely on algorithms or stay within the four corners of the resolution without going beyond are not going to get every vote right. And at Strive, we don't just use one level of human review. We actually have 3 levels of human review, and I sign off on every single ballot before we press send. Another thing that I'm proud of, in addition to the just commitment and dedication of our voting team, is what I like to call radical transparency for the asset management proxy voting space. Every single vote that we submit is on Strive's website within 48 hours. I'm not aware of any other asset manager that does that. Perhaps there are, but for most asset managers, the only time you're going to find out how they voted their proxy ballots that year is when they file their Form NPX with the Securities and Exchange Commission. And then you have to go searching through the SEC's arcane Edgar system. And for those of you who have used the system, well, let me just say I empathize and I feel your pain. With that as the background of how we have a philosophy on voting and how we approach it, let's dive into some of the votes. I want to start with executive compensation. The ever-present and always witty Charlie Munger, may he rest in peace, summed up this issue best when he said, "Show me the incentive and I will show you the outcome." Everyone at the end of the day, including named executive officers, are fiduciary to themselves. So if you put a marker out there, normal human behavior, self-interest, will suggest that a corporate officer will attempt to hit or exceed that mark. Now, if that marker has absolutely nothing to do with driving shareholder value, this creates major misalignment between officers' actions and their duty to investors. Again, that fiduciary duty has two components, a duty of care and a duty of loyalty. Right now, we are at a point where 73% of the companies in the S&P 500 tie a portion of executive comp to some form of ESG. This is up from 68% in 2022. As an aside, earlier this year, I had a very long talk with a prolific pro-ESG business reporter, and he expressed great concerns about the growing number of companies that are using ESG and exec comp, and also the growing percentage of exec comp that is being tied to ESG. In his opinion, this is a grift where companies are putting in non-specific metrics that named executive officers can get their bonuses and get paid during down years, because oftentimes the ESG metrics that are put into exec comp are not explained in any detail whatsoever. They're very opaque. So why do we think this is the most important vote? We are concerned that corporate America is setting itself up for failure by, frankly, distracting company leaders with arbitrary DEI metrics to hit or carbon emissions scope 3 reduction goals that have nothing to do with driving performance. So it's a distraction, it's a waste of time, and there's no evidence that most companies are using this to drive shareholder value. Why is this happening at such an increasing rate then? Well, BlackRock in 2022 listed one of its top goals as to get companies to tie exec comp to ESG. And of course, most folks have seen the famous video of BlackRock CEO Larry Fink saying what they do there is force corporate behaviors. Ask yourself a simple question though. If tying exec comp or ESG or any other corporate action was accretive to shareholder value, why would anyone have to force that behavior? Companies would already be doing it. Let's take a look at one famous example from last year that we voted on. Southwest Airlines. They listed as the top 3 criteria in executive comp bonuses, response recovery, system improvements, and ESG, which they self-defined as DEI and sustainability. Well, you may recall during last holiday season, Southwest Airlines grounded flights for 10 consecutive days. That was over 16,000 flights. And so in their proxy statement, they fully admitted that they missed on response recovery, they missed on system improvements, but they outperformed on DEI and sustainability. And Southwest CEO got his largest bonus ever. And if these 3 were equally weighted, they actually outperformed by 250% on ESG. Of course, if you're a commercial airline, there's no better way to reduce your carbon emissions than grounding your fleet for 10 days during a busy holiday season. By the way, we voted against that executive compact, but BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard all voted in favor of it. Proxy Advisory Service, ISS, and Glass Lewis, they both voted in favor of it. How, when a company is missing on these main metrics of response recovery and system improvements, could you possibly endorse this executive compensation package? And again, I mentioned earlier, we don't just vote in silence. We've engaged with lots of companies where we voted against their exec compact. And guess what? The response rate has been amazing. Not just the response rate, but the receptivity. Companies are eager to talk to us to get our perspective on executive compensation. Why? Because as it turns out, a lot of these companies didn't want this behavior forced on them in the first place. A lot of these companies were afraid they weren't going to get financing from large ESG capital market participants, and they just had behavior forced on them that they didn't want it. Let's take a quick look at where DEI comes into another place. That's the S proposals of ESG. DEI proposals generally make up the largest category of what you would define as S proposals, the social proposals. One of these proposals that's seen an uptick in the last few years are calls for companies to conduct what's known as a racial equity audit. One vote that stood out in 2022, because it's an earlier shareholder meeting, was the vote at Apple, where more than 53% of the vote went in favor of Apple conducting a racial equity audit that the board there opposed. Well, what happened after that was many large companies actually agreed to conduct a racial equity audit instead of have that proposal go to a vote on their ballot. What does this show? That one vote isn't necessarily a vote just at that company. They can often have ripple effects, not just throughout the industry, but across industries. And what is a racial equity audit? Well, first thing to note is that it's highly political. How do I know this? Well, the two most prominent lawyers that lead racial equity audits in America are none other than Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch. So again, go ahead and tell us how these are not political. And when they put these on the ballot, you'll often see that there's actually no evidence, not even a claim, that racial equity audits are meant to drive shareholder value. In our engagement with companies on DEI, we often ask, if you're conducting a racial equity audit or if you've made diversity commitments, have you conducted a cost-benefit analysis? The answer is almost universally no. And so again, there's no claim that we're driving shareholder value by conducting a racial equity audit. And this year, we've actually seen a couple of other proposals that are pretty interesting on the topic that we go deeper into in our long form document. But one of them is essentially like the racial equity audit on steroids, you could call it. One of them earlier this year was to Bank of America. Now, after calls the last few years for it to conduct a racial equity audit, what Bank of America did was announce more than a $1 billion+ commitment to racial justice causes. Well, this proposal in 2023 said, great, now that we've got you to make the commitment, here are the folks that we think you should give the money to. So they not only got the commitment from Bank of America, now they want to direct how those funds are going to be spent. Again, with no evidence of driving shareholder value. Let's quickly transition to talk about the largest topic that shows up on shareholder ballots for proposals, and that's E, environment and energy proposals. Nearly every shareholder proposal in this space has an emission reductions target based on an international organization or the Paris Climate Accords, arbitrary and ever-changing amounts of emission reductions and timelines. Other asset managers like to say that climate risk is an investment risk. But these proposals are making some pretty grandiose assumptions. They're making the assumption that they can predict not 5, not 10, but often 25+ years out what geopolitical rules are going to be in place for corporations when it comes to carbon emissions. Not only that, again, they're changing the goalposts all the time, but on the other axis, they're trying to say that emissions need to be reduced by Y amount. So again, 25+ years of political predictions joined up by 25+ years of these are the emission reductions targets that we need. I would say that that's a massive risk to take a bet on when it comes to your investments. And so when you can't predict what your state, local, or federal government's going to roll out next week, how are you going to make a prediction of worldwide, global rules for carbon 10, 20, 25+ years out? And think about it from a macro level. If the West decides that we're all going to agree to the same commitment and go on and force behaviors of both individuals and corporations within our societies, I would call that an international suicide pact. Why? Because who's not going to go along? Authoritarian regimes. So I don't think it's the goal of the pro-stakeholder ESG advocates to give Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping more power. But if we all agree to go along with their dictates, that's what's going to happen because they're not going to follow the rules that you're laying out. Other proposals in this space that are fairly interesting, and we go deeper into the document, are proposals that call on companies to align their retirement plans with some international commitment. Now, why are these interesting? Because a lot of the companies that get these proposals have made commitments to things like the Net Zero Asset Manager Alliance or some other net zero commitment. And this shows the risks of making the commitment in the first place, because they're not just going to ask you to make the commitment in sector A of your business. They're going to have you do it across the board. And we're seeing this too with proposals to lots of banks talking about their financing. Again, read more about these in the longer form document. But I want to talk about an interesting governance proposal that was new this year that we hadn't seen before. And that's because in late 2022, the Delaware legislature amended Delaware general corporate law to extend a provision allowing for the limitation of personal liabilities for breaches of fiduciary care to executive officers of a corporation. Previously, such exculpation was much more limited. So following that change, at least in our holdings, 26 companies put proposals on the ballots seeking to amend their bylaws to add in this exculpation. Well, Strive voted against these management resolutions. Why? Well, because we're looking out for shareholders, right? Egregious violations of the duty of care, shareholders should have the right to redress this. And companies making feigned claims that they're not going to be able to get talent, we just weren't buying those claims because they didn't offer any evidence. Also, companies of this size and stature should have directors and officers liability insurance that could help make shareholders whole in such an instance. One area that I want to talk about a little bit more in depth too is the most often mislabeled bucket of proposals. These are so-called anti-ESG resolutions. Now, again, despite what the media may tell you, Strive is not an anti-ESG shop. We are not a right-wing shop. We aren't asking companies to move to the political left or the political right. We want them to move forward. So how do I know that our voting is more nuanced than others when it comes to this space? Well, Morningstar dug into the data. And when it comes to, again, these quote anti-ESG resolutions, Strive in the Fortune 100 voted for about 60% of these anti-ESG resolutions. We abstained or voted against about the other 40%. BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and Engine Number One voted against 100% of these proposals. Again, are they looking past the taxonomy? It's hard to say. One such so-called anti-ESG resolution are resolutions related to risk of company operations in China. One such proposal was at Starbucks. It's interesting to note that when Russia invaded Ukraine, Starbucks closed all 130 of its stores that were in Russia. Well, Starbucks also has a goal of having 9,000 stores built in China by the end of 2025. Well, what happens on the day that they celebrate the opening of their 9,000th store in China and Xi Jinping decides to invade Taiwan? Are they going to close all 9,000 locations? I don't know the answer to that, and neither does any other investor. And that's a problem. So we voted for more disclosure. Why aren't other asset managers voting for more disclosure when it comes to China risk? At Strive, we know that China risk is investment risk. Other issues that came up in this space, there were shareholder proposals calling on companies that have DEI programs in place to return to a merit-based hiring and promotion program. And they went further, and they explained that there's potentially some serious legal risk in hiring and promotion and supply chain diversity targets. Then what happened? Well, we voted for a lot of these proposals because, again, there's clear legal risk out there. Then the Supreme Court decided the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard case, which put a very big spotlight on this issue, ending affirmative action for higher education. So these proposals served, again, as a canary in the coal mine to say there's tremendous legal risk that you're ignoring. And as a shareholder, we want to know how you're addressing that risk. How are you mitigating this legal risk? And again, almost every company that had this on the ballot, they all opposed the proposal. And again, large asset managers, why aren't they asking for more disclosure on legal risk? One narrow proposal that I want to hit on really quickly was on the cost and benefit of diversity, equity, and inclusion, specifically at MasterCard. There, the proponent noted that MasterCard has an extensive diversity, equity, and inclusion program for hiring, promotion, etc., and simply wanted to know what the costs and benefits to shareholders of that program is. Shouldn't shareholders have the right to that information? Are you making money or losing money on this growing area of your business? Again, the company opposed the proposal. BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard all voted against it, and ISS and Glass Lewis recommended votes against it. Why don't they want to know the costs and benefits of such programs? Again, there's more on this in the link. I encourage you to click through and read it after. But I want to talk about our approach to board members. Across all of our votes, the data shows that we voted for about 75% of directors and withheld, abstained, or voted against the remaining 25%. In the S&P 500, those numbers jump to 70% for and 30% against, withhold, or abstain. We look at the director's background, at their experience, at their social media posts. Why are they at that company? Are they at that company to push shareholder value or to inject values such as ESG and DEI that aren't accretive to shareholder value? And if we find that the director was put on specifically for ESG or DEI reasons, we vote against them. If we find that they're simply in their public life advocating for non-pecuniary factors, we abstain from them because we can't support that behavior, but we don't have direct evidence to impugn that characteristic to their seat on that specific corporate board. We also take a look at board structure. Is this a company that ties executive compensation to ESG, for example? If so, we vote against the chairman of the executive compensation committee to hold that individual accountable for that non-pecuniary activity. Are they the head of the ESG committee itself or the ESG committee by any other name? We would also vote against them for that reason. And again, this shows Strive's human touch versus an algorithmic based approach, right? A lot of algorithms are designed to say, well, Mr. Smith is on 3 or more boards, so we're automatically going to vote against him because we consider him to be overboarded. What if Mr. Smith is the best, most qualified board member at that board? That vote is nonsensical. It's based on a computer. It's not based on a 3-level human review of every single board member at every single company that we do here at Strive. Believe me, it's a labor of love, and I want to, thank in front of this audience the entire team that we put together this season of dedicated professionals who are dedicated to the proposition that the capital markets in the United States of America are worth saving, that shareholder primacy is worth saving, that the road to stakeholder capitalism, the European style that European nations have been trying for more than 30 years, it's a very dark road, both literally and figuratively. And so that's why we're here at Strive. That's why we're voting 100% as a pro fiduciary. That's why we're engaging 100% as a pro fiduciary. We think it is a worthwhile endeavor. And again, it's no easy task, but I'm very proud of the team that we've built. I'm proud of the organization that we've built. And we think this is where the puck is going in the proxy voting space and the corporate engagement space. As we conclude, before we head to our question and answer session, I want to touch on a few topics that have been in the headlines lately. The first is proxy voting choice. You'll note that some large asset managers have begun to offer a certain subset of their clients the seeming, and I do say seeming, ability to vote their proxy ballots as they see fit. Well, first of all, it's not as they see fit. When it comes to BlackRock and State Street specifically, they're offering policies. Those policies, again, come from the proxy advisory firms, Institutional Shareholder Services, and Glass Lewis. Both foreign entities, by the way, so American shareholder primacy is not their main concern. And these policies are generally very pro ESG, DE&I. And Vanguard, they have offered a pilot program this past year. So we'll see where their program goes in the future. So again, when you're being set up with a ESG policy and you have to vote in line with those recommendations, you're not actually getting your ballot back to do with as you see fit. So that's the first misnomer that's been spreading throughout the media on proxy voting choice. The second misnomer that I want to hit on really quickly is the seeming feigned, what we call the feigned retreat, right? And there's more on this in the opening letter in our document, in our postseason review. But there's been a lot of headlines that large asset managers such as BlackRock and State Street simply aren't voting for ESG shareholder proposals as they did in the past. Well, there's a couple reasons that you can just tease out really quickly to see why that might be. First of all, this past year, there was more ESG shareholder proposals than ever before. So even if BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard voted on the same exact amount, well, the numerator denominators changed, so the percentage is, of course, going to go down. And second, you can read the rationale. And a lot of times, the rationale for BlackRock or Vanguard or others voting against an ESG proposal is because they note that through their prior years of voting and engagement with the company on that topic, the company has already adopted that behavior. So the vote would be unnecessary and redundant because the company's already engaged in the underlying behavior that the proponent of the shareholder proposal saw. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to questions. The first question is, Strive voted against a significant number of CEOs, sometimes at well-performing companies. True. Why did we do that? It's a fair question, and a question that the media has asked as well. In some instances, what we are doing is holding the leadership of a company accountable when they have what we would consider an egregious non-pecuniary program. So hiring based on diversity quotas rather than merit. Right. So Jane Frazier at Citigroup is an example. We're not saying she's underperforming as a CEO. We're just saying she's setting up the company for long-term failure by hiring based not on merit, but based on, again, skin surface characteristics. We also voted against the CEO of MasterCard for the same exact reason. And so, again, we're concerned that they're not being the best version of themselves, and they're setting up their companies for long-term failure by putting folks, in positions all from junior ranks to senior executives to board members for reasons that are non-meritocratic. So that's why we voted against so many CEOs, because, again, these programs are proliferating throughout corporate America at a growing rate. What else do we have in the chat? What is Strive's position about board-aligned voting policies? That's a good question. Institutional shareholder services, I think it was earlier this year or last year, I forget, but in recent years has instituted a board-aligned voting policy that essentially lines up in almost all instances with the recommendation of the board. So that's for every board member, for every management proposal, and for every shareholder proposal. Well, you can see by Strive's votes where we're voting against more than half of the executive compensation packages because they're tied, again, to non-pecuniary factors such as ESG, sustainability, and DEI. Well, no board that we saw is making a recommendation against the pay packages for their named executive officers. So there's a huge gap right there in a board-aligned policy. Again, what board members are making recommendations to have their other board members voted out, that's a very rare occurrence, right? But considering that at Strive, we're voting against 30% plus sometimes of the board members in the S&P 500, we would be misaligned on those as well. And so we think that it's interesting that folks are really, running towards this board-aligned policy as some sort of salve to protect against the proliferation of stakeholder capitalism, ESG, and DEI. We don't think it's the bomb that they think it is. So we do see some issues with a board-aligned policy. Let's see if there's any other questions in the chat. Let's see. Is Strive gaining traction and attention? If no, what needs to be done to change that? Well, I think we are. I think that when you look to the fact that our response rate when we contact companies seeking an engagement is now over 80%. And again, for a company that, is just in 13 months crossed over $1 billion in assets under management, and earlier this year was noted as the fastest growing asset manager in the world, I think that we are getting an outsized amount of attention for the size that we are based on our AUM. And I think that's only going to continue to grow over time. We've had many companies that are very excited to engage with us specifically. They know that we voted against a lot of their board members. They know in many instances we voted against their executive compensation package, or for shareholder proposals such as the China risk audit, that they opposed the resolution. They did not like the resolution. They certainly don't like the way that we voted on it, but they still want to talk to us anyway. And why is that? Again, because just as a lot of folks in this space know, the proxy vote is not a true reflection of capital, right? When two proxy advisory services control a dominant percentage of the market, and then large asset managers can make up the difference in getting a proposal over 50% or a board member voted out. They know that the conversations they've had over the last 5, 6, 7 years also was not a true representation of capital. With that, we're at time, but I do want to say a sincere thank you to everybody who took your time out of your busy schedules to join us. Again, visit us at strive.com, engage with us. And to those of you who asked questions in the chat that we didn't get to, I apologize. We will do our best to reach out via email as quickly as possible to answer all of your inquiries. But thanks again for your interest at Strive, and have a great day.